Hello, my name is Dave Pasquale. I'm the owner of Pasquale Aviation. In this video, I'm going to talk about an issue with the new AbleScope VA400. As you know, I am a strong proponent of doing cylinder inspections. We do them on every airplane that comes in for annual inspection, as well as a bunch in between. We've had a couple of issues where the new scope gets caught in between a valve and the valve seat when we're looking at the valve stem. And I've talked to some of my colleagues and they've run into the same issue. If that happens, the only way I know of to get the scope out without ruining the scope is to take the rocker cover off and use a spring compressor to relieve the spring pressure on the valve that you got the scope stuck in order to be able to remove the scope from the cylinder. What I've done and what I want to talk about in this one is a way that I started looking at the valve stems to try to prevent the scope from getting caught in the cylinder. So the current method, or the method I talk about in my video on cylinder inspections, is to take the scope and if this is the spark plug hole, to take the scope and kind of work it in through the hole and bend it around as you go into the valve seat, because the valve seat's going to be right next to the spark plug hole. So keeping the tip of the scope really close to the cylinder head and basically sliding it along and then trying to fit it in between the valve and the valve seat. It worked fine on the old scope, but I'm guessing the new scope is just a little bit longer, or possibly the distance from the flexible portion of the scope to the end, that solid tip, is a little longer or something. I'm not really sure why it's doing that from the standpoint of the scope. I know some engines are more susceptible to it. It's probably airplanes or engines that have lifters that leak down a little faster than others. Some of them, if you open the valve by rotating the crankshaft and you get the valve all the way open, if you put the scope in and watch it, you can actually see the lifter bleeding down under the spring pressure of the valve spring. So you'll see the valve as it's all the way open. This is the seat here and this is the valve. You'll see the valve just slowly closing a little bit. If you have the scope in there and it's already a little bit tight, that little bit of movement is going to pinch the scope. So what I started doing is push the scope all the way in. If this is the valve, if my hand's the valve, you push the scope all the way in and then you bring the scope back until you get to the edge of the valve, and then try to peek along the side of the valve in toward the valve stem. That way there, the scope never goes between the valve and the valve seat. So I'll try running it through here. Hopefully you can see on the monitor on the left side of the screen what's going on. But basically I'll push the scope in and bend it around. And I should say I have the intake valve is open right now. So if you look over here, you can see, I'll move the prop a little bit. You see the intake valve is all the way open. I seem to have more trouble with the intake valves catching the scope than the exhaust valves for some reason. So I'll do it on this one. So the way I do it is I look at, if you push the scope all the way in and bend the tip around so it's pointing back at the cylinder head, you can see the exhaust valve's over here and the intake valve is over there. And you can just see a little bit of the seat right in here. So I'm gonna rotate, you can see I rotate the scope around till I can see just the intake valve, and I'm aiming for the edge in here. And it takes a little bit of practice, and sometimes it takes a little bit of finagling, but I pull the scope, start slowly pulling the scope out and keep the scope fixated on that edge. And as you get close to the edge of the valve, you start to see, now you can see how there's more of the seat showing up. I start to release the scope a little bit to just stay on line, on target with the edge. Now here I'm looking past the edge and I'm more focusing on the seat, and you can just see down in here is the valve guide, but it's not very visible because the white edge of the valve is causing the camera to wash out the picture. So you got to kind of play around a little bit with the angle of it until you can get the exposure right on the image. And you see right in there, that's pretty close, right there. There it is right there. And that's where I would take the picture. Like I said, it takes a little bit of practice. I'll run through it again here. Maybe I'll reposition the camera on the screen so you can see that image better. So I'm turning the camera toward my computer. So looking at the computer screen, so here's what I'm doing. Right now the scope is straight. I'm bending it around toward the cylinder head by pushing the plunger in. And I have the scope right now, the hook of the scope is pushing against the piston. It's pushing against the piston. Over here is the exhaust valve, an intake valve over here. This is the area we're focusing on, so I'm rotating the scope to bring the intake valve into view. And here's the intake valve, and we're going to shoot for this area right here. So now I'm pulling the scope out of the cylinder a little bit, and as I pull it out of the cylinder, I'm going to slowly release the plunger to keep the scope in line with this area of the image right here. So I'm coming out, and as I'm pulling out here, now I'm starting to focus on the valve seat right there. And you keep pulling the scope out and bending it around. And right there, that's the valve guide down in there and the valve stem. But you got to get it to where, you know, as you're right in here, the reflection of the light off of the edge of the valve causes the camera to compensate with a negative exposure and makes the area you want to see, which is in the shadow, makes that area dark. So you got to play around with the angle of the image a little bit until you get enough of the light going down in toward the valve stem, and the exposure corrects itself for the area you want to see. And that's what we got right there. And this, when doing it this way, the scope never goes in between the valve and the valve seat. So hopefully that'll prevent the scope from being stuck. So I'm going to turn the camera back around here. So hopefully that'll correct any of the issues that we've been having. Like I said, it takes a little bit of practice to get it down. But you know, this is last year I went through 3 of these scopes. This one here is the 3rd one I bought in a year's time. The first 2 were damaged from being pinched. The first one I tried to pull out, I tried to wiggle it. It had gotten caught and it was bent, and I tried to wiggle it back and forth like this until I could get it to come out, and it didn't work. What it did is it pinched the end of this, had actually gotten crushed a little bit, and it changed the focus of the light, or of the camera. The second one had gotten pinched and a little bit deformed, but by then I had started pulling the rocker covers off and compressing the spring in order to release the tension on the valve and on the scope. What ultimately failed on that one, if I can pull it back here, as you see on the edge of the scope, there's this link section that is flexible, and then there's a solid end. The camera's in this black part on the scope. The black part of the scope separated from this little silver disc at the end of the flexible portion. I had glued it back on, and it worked for a while, and then it started coming loose. It never was in danger of falling in the engine, but it's hanging by wires and it's uncontrollable at that point. So rather than mess around with it, I bought another scope. So anyway, hopefully that helps all of you. Obviously, if you have any questions or anything, you know, just hit me out on my website or leave a comment, and I'll try to get back to you on it. So thanks for watching. Talk to you later.